There is a growing sense of frustration amongst West Ham fans about the way this transfer window is developing. And to be honest, I completely understand why. Most supporters accepted that there was going to be a degree of change this summer. We knew some of our more valuable players were likely to leave, particularly the likes of Matthias Fernandes and Crysencio Somerville. And in some ways, there was some relief when Jared Bowen and Konstantinos Mavropanos committed themselves to the season ahead. Because at least we knew we weren't losing absolutely everybody. But now we're getting to the stage where you start looking at the squad and thinking, hang on a minute, how many more players are actually going to leave? Because we know the likes of Nicholas Fulkrug, Aaron Wan-Bissaka, Jean-Claire Todibo are leaving. They're no longer part of Nuno's plans. And there are clubs lining up to take each of them. I understand that Aston Villa are close to sealing the Wan-Bissaka deal. Venezia, we're trying to get more money up front for the sale of Nicholas Fulkrug. And apparently a French club, thought to be Monaco, are looking like they're going to win the race to sign Jean-Claire Todibo, even though there are quite a few Italian clubs that are meant to be interested in the player as well. But that aside, there's now talk of El Hadji Malik Diouf, Songuta Magassa, and again, possibly Tati Castellanos being available for sale as well. And that is where the frustration really is coming into play. Not necessarily the fact that players are being sold, it's kind of what happens after. Because over the last three transfer windows, we've lost an awful lot of players. Kudus, Paqueta, Agerd, Guilherme, Emerson, players who are out of contract, Creswell, Soufal, and so on. You know, from last summer until now, we've lost a huge amount of players. And then you add in this summer with Matthias Fernandes, Somerville, Freddie Potts, Callum Wilson's contract expiring, Adama Traore leaving, Axel Disasi's loan coming to an end. There's a huge amount of experience and playing ability that's gone through the door. And the sales over the last three windows, including this one, so far has generated about £280 million. Sure, we've spent money, of course. You know, last summer we signed Magassa, Hermansen, Malik Diouf, Pablo in the winter, Castellanos, Matthias Fernandes we signed last summer, Jean-Claire Todibo we signed, you know, moving from his loan deal to permanent. So we've spent money, spent about £200 million of the 280 that we've generated back. But this summer, we've spent almost nothing by adding Joel Veltman on a free transfer and Manor Solomon for around £5 million plus add-ons. So there is very obvious imbalance between what we've generated, and for once, we've generated some good money for players, and what we're currently spending. And that's why supporters are asking questions. Because let's say Malik Diouf goes for 45 million. Let's say Magassa for 25. Let's say Castellanos for another 35. Then this summer alone, we're potentially close to selling around £250 million worth of players just this summer alone. But we've barely spent anything in return. So you can understand why fans are looking at that and thinking, well, where's the money going? Well, we do have the financial situation. We do know that we've got about £200 million owing in outstanding transfer commitments. But that doesn't mean we've got to find all that money now. A lot of these deals are paid over installments over a period of time. But it does mean the club has financial commitments that we have to manage. Then there's the whole issue surrounding Daniel Kretinsky. We were told, or we were led to believe, that there was an expectation that his financial backing would give this club greater manoeuvre in the transfer window. Well, that hasn't happened in the way many fans expected. And with all the uncertainty surrounding the Gold family shares and Amanda Staveley's proposed involvement, there are obviously questions about whether the ownership situation is having an impact on this football club or not. We don't really know, but I think we all kind of do know that it is having an impact. And that's also part of the problem, because when you don't have much information to go on about what's going on at this football club, fans start naturally trying to work it out for themselves. But are we looking at a player recruitment strategy from completely the wrong angle. Now, take the players that West Ham are currently linked to. We're still linked to Arnie Engels from Celtic for potentially £25 million. There is the alternative of Jordan James for 10 million, but apparently Wolves are close to getting him to sign for them. We've got the offer on the table for Axel Disasi for 25 million. We're still waiting on the player to decide there. And then we've got Troy Parrott, potentially a deal that's close for around another 20 million. Now, these aren't bargain basement signings. If West Ham brought, say, 3 of those players in, you're suddenly spending a significant amount of money for a club that's in the Championship. And perhaps that's where the free transfers and the cheaper deals come into the equation. Because maybe the club isn't trying to replace every player who leaves with an equivalent transfer fee. Maybe it's trying to save money in certain areas so that we can spend money in other areas. And that would make sense. Let's take Malik Diouf as an example. If he does leave for around 45 million pounds, and let's say we bring in free agent Dennis Churkin from Sunderland. Some fans are going to go, well, hang on a minute. How are you selling 45 million pounds worth of a player and replacing him with someone who costs nothing? But that's not necessarily the comparison we should be making. The question should be, does Dennis Churkin actually give Nuno what he needs for that position? And if the answer is yes, then the money generated from Malik can go to be used elsewhere for the other players that we're targeting, like Parrott and so on. That's potentially the thinking. I'm not saying it's going to work that way, but I can understand that if that's the logic. And this is where the argument about ambition gets interesting, because fans are already asking, where is the ambition? Why are we looking at the likes of Jamie Vardy? Why are we looking at the likes of Reece Nelson? Why are we signing free agents? Because if that's the ambition we're talking about, you've got to look at this season and ask ourselves, what's our plan? We're not in the Premier League. We're not going to go out and compete with Premier League clubs for big name signings or big money signings. What we've got to do is ask ourselves whether these players can deliver in the Championship, because the whole idea of what we need right now is winning promotion. Now, I've said throughout the summer that I think West Ham need a mixture of youth and experience. I still believe that. But experience doesn't have to cost £20 million. If Jamie Vardy comes in, stays fit, scores goals in the Championship, does it really matter whether he costs 20 million or nothing? And a lot of fans would actually turn around and go, well, fair play. You've only got to look at Callum Wilson last season, and if only he'd stayed, because we knew that for the cheap deal that we got him in, finally fans, warmed towards him. And many fans wanted him to stay because they knew he would have scored a hatful of goals in the Championship for us this season. Now, if Reece Nelson comes in and he can provide pace, he can provide backup to Jared Bowen, he's got experience, etc., without a big transfer fee involved, then why wouldn't we consider it? I know his injury record is pretty poor, but the important thing is, if he stays fit, can he contribute? And that's perhaps what Nuno's looking for. Players who know how to handle the pressure of the Championship. Players who have played a load of games. And then alongside them, you've got the younger players who you could develop. You've seen Lewis Orford, who impressed in pre-season and in the first game of the season against Portsmouth. And then you've got a perfectly reasonable squad building strategy. The danger, of course, obviously, is that we get the balance wrong. If we get it wrong, then that could be a problem, because there are some positions where we simply do need quality, and that's where the potential signings of Engels, Disasi, and Parrott are so important. If West Ham can use the money that we've generated from sales to strengthen the areas of central attacking midfield, another central defender, another striker, etc., then suddenly the strategy that we're adopting looks considerably more sensible. Engels or James gives us something in midfield. Disasi in defence, we know what he offers. Parrott as another striker, again, a player that knows where the goal is. Now that starts to look like a squad designed to win the Championship rather than simply a collection of players assembled just because they're available or they're cheap. And that's the distinction, I think, which is really, really important here. Because I don't want West Ham spending money simply because it will make fans feel better. We've done that before. We've signed players that were available because they looked exciting or because everybody wanted a big name signing. It doesn't necessarily make for a good squad. We've seen the result of that. We've seen, I've just mentioned all the players that we've signed over the last couple of years. Where's that taken us? It's taken us to the Championship. Now, what matters is whether the manager has the right players to do the job he needs. And this job this season is straightforward. Get promotion, win promotion. It doesn't matter if we do it playing beautiful football or crap football every week, so long as we win. If Nuno gets the team to scrape 1-0 wins and picks up enough points to get us promoted this season, are you really going to complain about that? Might be boring to look at, to watch, but if we win promotion, isn't that the ultimate goal? And that's why someone like Vardy could potentially make more sense than people think. I'm not saying we should sign him. I'm not particularly in favour, but I'm saying that I can understand why the club would look at him, because he wouldn't necessarily be a starter every game, but what a sort of backup to bring on in the last 10, 15 minutes of a game. And that same reason applies to other experienced players that we're looking at. If they're cheap, if their wages are manageable, and if Nuno believes that they can contribute, then there's nothing wrong with using that market. But we are now at a point where the club has to start delivering. We've got Burnley in 4 days' time. Sure, we've signed Manor Solomon now as well. The season's about to begin, and there are obvious weaknesses still in this squad. I've said it many times. Creative midfield, another striker, and more defensive cover, more strength in depth. So the next 3 weeks of this transfer window is going to tell us whether there is a sensible strategy in place or whether we're simply ending up selling too many players without replacing them properly. And that's the real test. Because if we get to September and we've sold Diouf, Castellanos, Magassa, as well as seeing the likes of Fulkrug, Wan-Bissaka, Todibo go, but if we brought in the right replacements and strengthened the squad in the areas that Nuno needs, then perhaps we'll look at this window very differently. But if we get to September and we're still sitting there wondering why we've generated all this money in transfer sales and still have the same weaknesses in the squad, then the criticism is going to be completely justified. And there is another question that I think the club needs to answer. What happened to the idea that West Ham didn't have to sell because of our financial issues? Because that's one thing that supporters were kind of led to believe. Because the club's finances were supposed to be in a position where player sales were not essential. And yet here we are, another summer, for once, a huge amount of money being generated through transfer sales. That's different, at least. But supporters are watching what we're spending very closely. That's why Kretinsky's position really matters here. If his financial injection doesn't arrive, and it doesn't look like it will happen, fans are naturally going to wonder whether the uncertainty around the ownership structure is affecting the club. I think we all know the answer to that. It definitely is. But until someone explains what's going on, the speculation will continue. And that's probably why this transfer window feels really uncomfortable at the moment. We know we've sold players. We know more players are leaving. We know the club is generating significant amount of money, but we know there are still holes in this squad that need to be filled. And we don't yet know exactly how much of the money we've got to be able to spend. Someone apparently mentioned £40 million available, but then we don't know if we sell more players from here on in, whether that's 40 million plus what else we generate. So if we generate 45 million from Malik, that's a 20 million pound profit. We only spent 19 million on him. So will that money that we generate, profit, will that go into this 40 million kitty or not? But I don't think we should assume that the lack of spending or the lack of spending big is a sign of a lack of ambition. Sometimes the cleverest signing doesn't cost you 20, 25 million pounds. If we get Cherkin in, who can come in for nothing and do a job at left back, fantastic. Veltman gives us experience and reliability without a transfer fee. Even that's good. Solomon if he contributes, having come in for £5 million, fantastic. Then use the bigger money where it matters. Go and spend the 25 million on Engels. Go and spend the 25 million on Disarcy. Go and spend the 20 odd million on Parrott, because then that makes sense. Then bring in the likes of Vardy and Nelson to provide decent backup. And perhaps that's where the focus has to be. It's not about how much money we can spend on any one player, but whether the players we bring in are right for the promotion push that we all want. Look, I can live with older players. I can live with cheaper deals. What I can't live with is selling our best players, collecting huge fees, and then failing to give Nuno the squad he needs. And if we've got 3 weeks left to find out which side of that line West Ham are going to end up on, well, we've got the clock is ticking. Burnley, 4 days away. Transfer window closes in 3 weeks. And right now, West Ham fans are asking, not asking for miracles, but asking to see some more action in the transfer window. We're asking to see a plan. And if that plan is to combine experienced free agents with few carefully chosen big money signings, then perhaps we need to give that a chance. But those big money signings now have got to arrive, because that's where the frustration will certainly turn into something more serious if it doesn't happen.